Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Wakefield Master's first Shepherd's play. Now, this is much less well-known, much less popular than the second Shepherd's play, which I've already done a video about. But I think maybe partially because I'm a contrarian by inclination, I actually quite like the first Shepherd's play. I think it's interesting and bizarre in different ways than the second Shepherd's play is interesting and bizarre. Because that's the thing that people like about the second Shepherd's play, is it's so weird. You've got this opening portion where these shepherds are talking about how difficult life is. Then you've got this extended scene where Max steals a sheep and pretends it's a baby, and it's just bonkers. And then they go and see the baby Jesus. The first Shepherd's play is not as bonkers, but it also is really interesting. It does things. So first off, it covers the same basic material. You have the shepherds who get the announcement of Jesus' birth from an angel, and then they go and see the baby Jesus at the end. So the same material is covered, and that's interesting, actually. And I'll tell you why in just a second. But it's not as sort of insane and nonsensical as the second Shepherd's play, but it does have its own peculiar charms. So I want to start with the reason that it's interesting that the same subject matter is covered in the first and second Shepherd's play. And that's because this is some good evidence that the Townley manuscript, what had been known for a long time as the Wakefield cycle, is actually not a cycle at all. So what I mean by a cycle is in the medieval period, in towns like York and Chester, there were Corpus Christi cycles, series of plays which would be performed in a row, and they were created to be performed sequentially, right? And they told the story of biblical history, basically for an audience who could not read the Bible, but whom the sort of socio-cultural, theologico-political world of the medieval period required that they understood at least basic theological doctrine. So this was what Louis Althusser would call an ideological state apparatus, right? These plays served a specific pedagogical function, a teaching function. It was thought for a long time that the 32 plays of the Townley manuscript, named that because the family who owned them who owned the manuscript was the Townley family. It was thought that they were a cycle that came from the town of Wakefield in West Yorkshire. Now, according to the editors of the Broadview Anthology of Medieval Drama, out of which I'm reading the first Shepherd's play, that's not what people think anymore, what scholars think anymore. It's more likely, according to contemporary scholarly opinion, that the Townley manuscript consists of a bunch of individual plays that were collected up, 5 of which are thought to be by someone conventionally called the Wakefield Master, including the first Shepherd's play, the second Shepherd's play, Herod the Great, the Buffeting of Christ, and Noah. So those are the 5 plays conventionally attributed to the Wakefield Master because they have stylistic similarities. Anyway, so that's enough background. Let's talk about the first Shepherd's play. So again, the content itself is pretty much exactly the same as the second Shepherd's play, which again is the much more well-known one. So that's why I'm going to sort of set a lot of this discussion up in terms of comparison and contrast. So we start with shepherds. We got 3 shepherds. We've got, in the manuscript themselves, they're called first shepherd, second shepherd, third shepherd, but we actually get their names. The first shepherd is named Gibb, the second shepherd is named John Horn, the third shepherd is named Slowpace. So Gibb starts us out. And again, this is very similar to what we get in the second Shepherd's play. Gibb is basically complaining about how difficult life is for shepherds, for rural people. And specifically, his issue is that his sheep have all died because of a particular disease called liver rot. So he doesn't know that he's going to be able to pay his taxes. So he has to go to the market and get more sheep. So this is a bad business for him, because rather than going to the market and selling wool, selling fleece to make money, he has to go and spend money to get more sheep. So he's in a bad situation. And then John Horn comes on, the second shepherd, and he's talking about how there's like robbers and thieves and people who might steal from you and threaten your life, etc., etc. So what we get in this first portion is twofold. It serves two purposes. One is a theological purpose, right? Because it illustrates the characters suffering in the fallen world, right? So this is the world. This is post Adam and Eve. This is post expulsion from paradise. But Jesus has not yet come. He has not yet been sacrificed on the cross to redeem humanity. So this is one element here, is the suffering of humanity in the fallen world. But then the other thing is we have these specific discussions of shepherds suffering. So there's this one part, John Horn has just sort of come up on Gibb, and he recognizes him based on his clothing, right? He's wearing shepherd's clothing. And so he says, "I thought by your gown this was your array." Gibb says, "I am ever alike, I am ever alike, what I gars, is none in this Reich a shepherd fares worse." Reich being kingdom, or realm. So he's basically saying nobody in this realm, nobody in this kingdom, nobody in this life fares worse than shepherds. Shepherds suffer more than anybody else. And John replies to him, "Poor men are in the dike, and oft time Mars. The world is slike, and also helpers is none here." So he's basically saying, yeah, poor people always suffer. This is the nature of being impoverished, right? And so we get those elements. The other, so we've got that theological purpose, right? But the other purpose of this is that the audience for this play, especially if it was performed in Wakefield, but anywhere in Northern England, really, you would have had a lot of shepherds, you would have had a lot of rural people in the audience. And so by aligning these shepherds, these character shepherds, with the actual experiences and sufferings of the audience, they would be encouraged to see themselves as the shepherds of the play, the shepherds of the biblical story, to whom the angel comes to announce Jesus' birth. And so the moral lessons of the story, they come to identify with, because they see themselves in the place of these shepherds. The other big thing with the second shepherd's play, and this does differ, but there's a similarity here, is we get this, again, just insane interlude where Mac, who's another character in the second shepherd's play, steals a sheep, and then he and his wife pretend it's their baby. It's just bonkers, as I said. But we don't have that in the first shepherd's play. But we do have a more focused, carnivalesque element that I think is really, really interesting. We got a sort of double carnivalesque element here. And the carnivalesque was a really important component of medieval culture because, for the most part, medieval people's lives were dull. If you were a peasant, especially, your life would be very, very dull. Most of your time would be spent working. There was very little leisure time, very little sort of freedom, entertainment, stuff like this. But there were certain days of the year where you had festivals or sort of carnivals. You had these days where the normal social order could be inverted, where peasants took on the role of the nobility, or whatever it was. And you could mock the church, you could mock the nobility, etc. So it was licensed to misbehave. And it was these sort of delightful days for people. A lot of it was make-believe. A lot of it was sort of like town fairs, county fairs, things like this. And so we get two major elements of this. One is that Gib, who, remember, all of his sheep have died, he does this sort of pantomime where he's going to lead his sheep to market, his sheep that he doesn't have. So he's like leading these imaginary sheep. And John Horn is like, no, I'm not going to let you and your sheep pass. And it's this sort of weird game that they play. But the thing that's really striking about it is at the end of this little shtick, John Horn says, wilt thou but so? Knave, hence I bid flit, as good that thou do, or shall I thee hit on thy pate, low shall thou reel, I say, give the sheep space. So basically, this is a threat, but I'm imagining this, and this may be my this may be something I'm somewhat imposing on it, but I think this makes a lot of sense. I'm envisioning this as a kind of Punch and Judy type scenario, right? The Punch and Judy shows, which were major elements of British culture really up into the 20th century, where it was puppets, and you had Punch, who was the husband of Judy, and he would often just beat her with a stick or something. And it was regarded as great fun, even though it's actually horrific domestic abuse. But that sort of playfulness of like a fun beating, I guess. There's again that sort of carnivalesque element of sort of joy in that playfulness. But then there's this second bit where they have this long imaginary feast. Slow Pace, the third shepherd, shows up, and they talk for a little bit, and then the boy, who's a really minor character, basically comes along and is like, yeah, all your sheep are in the pasture, you could go see them if you want to. And Gib says, sit we down all three and drink, shall we then? And Slow Pace basically says, if we're going to drink, then I've got to eat. But they don't have anything. There's no food here. But they're imagining these, like, really rich meats and sauces and condiments and nice wines and ales and all this stuff. Like, they would never in their lives have had this. And the people in the audience would never in their lives have had this sort of decadent food. But there's such joy in their imagination of it that, again, I think on the one hand, it would have been an incredibly funny scene to have seen acted out. But I think there's this sort of mix of joy and sadness in that they're imagining all of this, and it's a good time. They're having fun, but that also kind of highlights that they'll never actually get this kind of feast. But what is promised here is the idea of heaven, right? Because this is one of the things. There's a medieval peasant conception of heaven, which is rooted in, like, basically freely available ale, food, crops always ripe, cows that milk themselves, things like this. Like, basically a world of abundance without labor is this sort of peasant conception of heaven. So this imagination of what is promised through salvation, I think, is actually, again, theologically important. But then the thing that I think is really, really interesting about the first Shepherd's play that we absolutely don't get in the second Shepherd's play is this really extended period in which the shepherds are talking about all of these Jewish and Greco-Roman prophecies. And so there was a thing in the medieval period done by scholars and theologians. It was a version of what's called biblical exegesis. And exegesis is basically a form of interpretation. Medieval biblical exegesis, one of the big things that was involved was, so everything for medieval Christian theologians had to be conceptualized in terms of Christ, right? So they went back to the Old Testament, none of which in its original context is about Jesus at all, because it's all written well before Jesus. And Jesus does not fit the traditional Jewish conception of the Messiah. The way that Jesus is messianic is a reconceptualization under Christian theology in order to make Jesus the Messiah in a way that he would not be according to Jewish tradition. But what these scholars do, these medieval scholars and theologians do, is they come back and they reinterpret Jewish scripture and a certain amount of Greco-Roman prophecy, poetry, things like this, as being about Jesus, prefiguring Jesus. And so one of the big elements of this, for instance, is that the Jewish patriarchs of the Old Testament become types of Christ. And what that means is basically they are read as embodying some important characteristic or characteristics of Jesus imperfectly. So you think Moses, I'll give you a quick example. Moses, for instance, becomes seen as a type of Christ. He redeems the Israelites from Egypt in the Bible, and so he is a redeemer figure the same way that Jesus is, but he does not save their souls. He does not save them in a sort of grand cosmological sense. He gets them out of Egypt and to the Promised Land. But we have Moses directly addressed by God, which is of course paralleled by direct addresses to Christ. We have Moses exiled into the wilderness before he can come back and redeem the Israelites, which is paralleled to Christ's temptation in the wilderness, and so on and so on. But then we have a divergence, right? Because Moses is not permitted to enter the Promised Land. He suffers, he dies, and he's not permitted to enter the Promised Land of Canaan. On the other hand, Jesus suffers and dies, but because he is the proper Messiah in Christian theology, he's allowed to enter heaven. So we've got, again, this is a lot of effort is spent on this by medieval thinkers, is figuring out, okay, how do these Old Testament patriarchs, prophets, whatever it is, align with Jesus and point to Jesus coming? The same thing is done with some Greco-Roman prophecy, philosophy, stuff like this. And this would not have been a thing that most medieval people, especially peasants, shepherds, rural people, would have been conversant in. But we've got this long section from about line 334 through to about 406. That's a long chunk where the shepherds are going through this list of prophecies and prophets and Old Testament figures and Greco-Roman figures and things like this. Adam is mentioned. King David is mentioned. Sybil, the ancient Greek oracle. Nebuchadnezzar, who puts Daniel in a furnace with a couple of other guys in the Bible. Jeremiah, Moses. Habakkuk, who I don't know who that is, Elijah, Elizabeth, I don't know who that is in the biblical context, Zechariah, King David again gets another mention, John the Baptist, Daniel, the Roman poet Virgil. Yeah, so it's a long interlude, right? It's a long interlude to spend on, here's an exhaustive list of all of the people who have prophesied the coming of Christ. But again, if you think about this and I'm sure it's dramaturgically very boring. It can't be fun to watch on stage 3 shepherds who realistically would not have had access to this kind of information just being like, oh, also, did you know that Zechariah prophesied the coming of a redeemer born of a virgin? It's got to be boring as hell to watch. But again, if you think about it in terms of what this play is supposed to do pedagogically, that it is a teaching tool that's meant to get a certain degree of theological information to an audience who can't themselves read the Bible, let alone read Latin poetry, Latin prophecy, things like this, it serves a very clear pedagogical purpose. And I think that's a much more developed element in the first Shepherd's Play than in the second Shepherd's Play. The sheep stealing incident of the second Shepherd's Play takes up, I'd say, seems like a little over half of the actual lines, and serves very little direct theological purpose, whereas here we have much more clear theological implications for the play.